Welcome back, everybody, to
Yeah.
another week of small group.
Yep. Because you haven't been, well, some of you have been in these groups before, but the grade 10s and 11 and 12s are back together. Why don't you guys take some time to go through your names, go through your high of the week and your low of the week. Go.
This is our second week in our new series, and we are unraveling lies. Is that what it's called? I forget.
Undoing.
Undoing
Not
lies.
unraveling.
Sorry, undoing lies. And last week when we had our large gathering, we talked about the lie that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, and how we wanted you guys to remember that to hold on to Jesus, you got to let go of your safety. And that was our one last week. So if that's intriguing to you and you don't know what we're talking about, you can go back and watch that on another YouTube video. You can't, because it was live.
It was live. It was in person.
Just
I was
kidding.
like, nope.
Sucks to suck.
They can't. If you missed it, you missed it.
That's right.
And so this week we're going to be talking about another lie. Before we dive into it, I want to tell you a little bit of a story. And so way back at my first pastoral job, when I was kind of interviewing to become an intern at the church, I met this guy named Curtis. He was the guy who was in charge of the youth group. He was the person I was going to be interning under. And essentially I went through all of the interview process and everything was great. And I got hired. And then he was like, sweet. Now that you're hired, in like a week, there's going to be a staff party at so-and-so's house, and it's cowboy themed. And so show up to the party and bring your best cowboy outfit and come and meet all of the staff for the very first time.
Sweet.
And so I was like, okay, that sounds great. I don't really have cowboy attire just laying around. So I went to my brother, who's a little bit more redneck than myself. Doesn't wear skinny jeans. Doesn't, I don't know. He's more cowboy-esque. And he did have a pair of cowboy boots just laying around the house. And so I decided, you know what? Put on the cowboy boots. They didn't really fit. I had to like squeeze into them and it really hurt because my feet are larger than whatever those cowboy boots were. And it was horrible, but I was able to fit in them. I got some jeans. I put on a flannel shirt and I thought, this is great.
Did you have a hat?
No.
Disappointed.
Couldn't find a hat.
I'm disappointed.
I had boots though.
Yeah,
so,
that's
you
pretty
know.
good.
And so I was like, great. I'm ready for this cowboy party thing to meet all of the staff for the first time. And so I drove to the location and I got out and I'd never been there before and I'd never met any of these people before, but I saw some staff that I recognized just from website photos. And I was like, oh, that's them. They're in the right place. And so I walked up to them and I introduced myself. And then I noticed, though, that they were all dressed normally.
So wait, this was in Saskatchewan?
Saskatoon, yeah.
People don't just all dress like cowboys there all the time?
No, they don't. They
That's
dress
disappointing.
normal. And well, it depends where you are, I guess. In Saskatoon, most people dress normal. And so I walked up to them and was like, hey, guys, because I thought, like, oh, this will be funny. I'll make fun of them because I don't know.
Because they weren't dressed up?
Yeah.
You were going to make fun of them?
Yeah.
Sweet.
I was going to be like, what's wrong with you? And so I walked up to them and was like, what the heck, guys? Where's your cowboy attire for this cowboy-themed party? And they were like, what? And they looked at me really confused. And I was like,
oh, no.
This staff party is cowboy themed, right? And they're like, no. And they had no idea what I was talking about. And I was like, oh. And then they're like, oh, yeah. Did Curtis tell you that? Yeah. That makes sense. That's what he did. No, this is just a normal party. And then the worst part was, so I show up to this thing, meet all these people for the first time dressed like a cowboy in shoes that don't fit. And the worst part is, Curtis didn't even go to the party. So I was just there by myself with all these people I'd never met, dressed like a cowboy. And so essentially, what?
How did you feel? Did you just stay at the party, didn't leave?
I stayed. I felt annoyed.
But not embarrassed.
No, not embarrassed. Because I'm like, it wasn't my fault.
That's true.
It was some guy being dumb. And speaking of being dumb, sometimes, with people you think you can trust them. I thought, hey, Curtis, he's a pastor. He's a guy. He wouldn't lead me astray.
Yeah.
Surely if he's telling me I'm going to a cowboy party, it's going to be a cowboy party.
Right.
And then I found out, oh, I can't actually trust Curtis. If he tells you you're going to a cowboy party, it's probably a lie. And so I learned a valuable thing in that moment, that sometimes there are people you can trust and sometimes there are people that you can't. And so we're actually going to talk about this theme a little bit more today, and specifically on trust and what we put our trust in. And our culture really puts a lot of trust and emphasis, not just in people, but in primarily feelings. And we're often told that the feelings that we have are fully trustworthy. And if you have a feeling, you should just trust it and lean into it. And your feelings should be what guides you in life, as to the career you go in and the path you want to take and the decisions you make. And
it's sort of like feelings will guide you to truth.
Yeah.
Is often kind of the underlying idea.
Yeah.
Without really thinking about it.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
And often, though, if we look at our feelings, that they can lead us astray. And it wasn't until very recently that people actually trusted their feelings. For most of history, most cultures and places, including our own, have said feelings are a terrible way to make life-altering decisions, and they're usually not fully trustworthy. And depending on how you're feeling in the moment, your judgment can be super clouded, and they're not that reliable. But our culture has taught us this lie, both intentionally and unintentionally, that we should always trust our feelings, and that feelings are like the guiding truth to who we are, and we can always just search them, and we'll be able to know ourselves better and be able to figure out what's true. And so when it comes to scripture and Jesus and God and the Christian worldview, it ultimately, Christianity would say that that's actually not true. That often our feelings are kind of like Curtis, where sometimes you can trust them and sometimes they're helpful, but lots of times they can lead us astray, and you can feel like you're going to a cowboy party, but it turns out you're not. And so today, our big main idea is this. It's that feelings aren't worth your trust, but Jesus is.
It's interesting that you talk about how most of history that wasn't the case. It feels a little bit like an overcorrection. Like we were like, maybe we should somewhat pay attention to our feelings and somewhat take them into consideration. But we've kind of given too much emphasis in sort of how it's gone. And so some people are realizing this.
And it is because it's not that you should totally avoid your feelings, that they are something that does exist, that at times can help you a lot. But they're just not fully trustworthy, and to always trust your feelings no matter what, it's not a great game plan for life and discerning truth. And so we're going to read a chunk of scripture from a book called Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a book found in the Bible in the Old Testament. Long story short, he was this thing called a prophet. A prophet was someone who essentially heard messages from God and would go out and speak them to people, often to kings and worldly powers. And so that's kind of what Jeremiah is doing all throughout the book, is that he's going to the leaders of Israel and saying, hey guys, the way that we've been living has kind of been off track, and God wants to get us back on track. And so in Jeremiah chapter 17, he has quite a bit to say on where we should put our trust and how our feelings can often deceive us. And so in your small groups, before we dive into this passage, why don't you guys take some time to read it together? And so the verses are Jeremiah 17, verses 7 to 8.
So my first question is, the word blessed can be confusing.
Yeah.
So do you want to just quickly, what's a synonym for blessed?
Yeah. Whenever I hear the word blessed, I now think of the Chance the Rapper song. Where the blessings come down. It's an old song now, but that's always what I think. It is not super helpful. Blessed in the Bible, essentially one of the best words for it is joyful, but also flourishing. It's someone who is able to flourish and essentially walk into what it truly means to be human, and they're experiencing who God is in a really full way, and they're kind of flourishing. That's someone who is doing an X thing. You could say oh, they're really flourishing in that, and you can see all the fruit it's producing in their life, and that this is a really great thing. And so that's kind of what the word blessed means. It doesn't just mean I don't know, the blessings come down, and
it can be a bit vague.
Yeah, where it's what does that even mean?
Yeah.
And so
they came across that word. That's why.
Yeah. And so, like you read in these verses, maybe your translation was a little bit different, but in ours, it says that those who trust in God are actually blessed, that they're actually flourishing. And then it goes into this picture image of they're kind of like a tree that's planted beside a riverbank, and they're able to have all of this life And it's because they've chosen to live their life in what God has said and put their trust in him. When you look at it and you're like, well, why would that be blessed? Why would you look at somebody who's like, I'm actually going to put my trust in God. I'm going to put my trust in Jesus. And that is actually the way to find a life that's actually blessed, that's flourishing, that looks like what it means to be truly human versus maybe trusting in something else.
Mm-hmm.
And it's essentially because God is the only person who actually sees life fully clearly, that we as human beings have such a limited aspect to be able to see what's true and what's not. And so often we're tempted to put our trust in ourselves and in our own feelings. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but those aren't super reliable as to discerning what truth is. Or we're tempted to put our trust in other people. And that's why there's a lot of figures like people like Andrew Tate that's really popular among young people, and people like Jordan Peterson or other commentators like PewDiePie and those people, that people love celebrities and following celebrities in their advice because they're looking for someone that they can trust. They're looking for someone who's going to lead them to the life of flourishing they're looking for. But the problem is nobody on our earth and nobody in themselves actually sees the full picture the way that God actually does. That he's the only one who's able to actually see things clearly and have like the most purest vantage point for telling people what true living actually looks like. It's kind of like being colorblind, where I knew this kid when I was growing up who was colorblind. He couldn't really see red. I don't know what he would see, but he wouldn't see red. He would see different colors, and depending on the different shades, it would look different to him. I have no idea what it looked like, but it didn't look like red. And it was always funny because he would sometimes just wear the weirdest things, where often he would wear totally red outfits, but he didn't know. And so he would like walk around in this red outfit and you'd be like, dude, what are you wearing? And he was like, what do you mean? And he's like, it's like, you're like covered in red. This is the only thing you're wearing. He's like, what? And he had no idea because he just couldn't see it clearly. Right. But to those of us who were able to see color fully, it looked really silly. And sometimes that's how other people's advice or putting your trust in something else can be like. That everybody on earth who's a human being is coming from a certain vantage point that is limited. That they might be really smart and intelligent and have great things to say, but at the same time, they are going to get stuff wrong. They are going to lead you astray, that you can't fully put your trust in them. But with someone like God, he's outside of time. He's all knowing. He's all powerful. He's able to see people fully and situations fully in a way that we just can't as humans. And so we're able to actually put our trust in him because he's someone who can actually lead us to life. And he's someone who, if you put your trust in him versus in other people or in yourself or in something else, that you'll find that you're actually able to live the blessed life you're looking for. Not that your whole life is perfect and that everything goes the way you want it to, but that you'll find that true wholeness and true flourishing is beginning to happen in you, and you're able to actually become the person that you were designed to be.
I like the imagery of the tree by the stream. Also just reminding us that God is the source of life, like you're talking about flourishing life. And so a lot of times when we're relying on our feelings or leaning into our feelings to guide us, it's sort of like concentrating on the fruit. Like if you're the tree, you're just like, I just want to like really grow the fruit, and you want those results. Maybe you're frustrated they're not happening, but the reality is that the fruit will happen as the roots. It talks about grow deep in towards the stream or the river. And that essentially like, leaning into the source of life and leaning into God with his, infinite perspective, right? But all-seeing perspective is gonna just produce the flourishing. We don't have to like focus on that. And I think sometimes, I know in my own life, when I've been thinking more about my feelings, it's sort of like I'm trying to just frustratingly produce the fruit.
Yeah. And even with that too, that God's almost like a steady rock that other things aren't, that we are constantly changing. And if you looked at even yourself and some of the things you thought when you were 6 years old versus some of the things you know and think now
Right.
that you fully would have believed back then
Mhm.
have changed because you've grown and you've learned more things and you've become a different person.
Mhm.
But God isn't like that either, that he's
Right.
someone who's actually really steady. The Bible talks about how he doesn't actually change, that he's someone who's
Mhm.
consistent. And that's because he's just in a whole different realm than we are.
Mhm.
And so he's actually a foundation that you can trust and put your
Mhm.
trust in and like plant your life beside and
Mm-hmm.
experience the flourishing and fruit that comes from being close to him and
Mhm.
putting your trust in him.
Yeah, so that leads us into our first question, which when we think of God, or anybody really, but we're asking you guys, or putting it out there, that maybe you should put your trust in God more than anything else. What qualities about somebody makes you want to be able to trust them? So I think I worded that better. Yeah. What makes someone trustworthy? That's the simple question we want you guys to discuss.
Next, Jeremiah has a little bit more to say, and he's going to kind of dive into our hearts and feelings a little bit more. And so, why don't you guys read Jeremiah 17, verses 9 to 10 together?
So when we talk about the heart too, we're talking about our desire center.
Yeah.
So like what we want, which is often led by our feelings.
Yeah.
So it's not like God is saying people are all trash.
No.
He's saying, because it kind of can be taken that way,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. You can be like, everybody sucks.
Everybody sucks.
And
Yeah.
who knows how horrible you are.
But he's more so when they talk about the heart in the Bible, they often are talking about our desires
Mhm.
and openness to allowing those to be molded and shaped. Or not. Like a hard heart would be like you're stuck in this is what I want and I will not change.
Yeah.
Whereas a soft heart, sometimes it talks about you're willing to let God shape you and shape your desires. But our feelings have a big impact on our desires.
I was in studying for this message. One of my favorite Bible teachers is a guy named N.T. Wright. And on this passage specifically, he kind of talked about the idea of how even with our own desires, the only way we can really analyze our feelings and if they're true about our desires is just by having more feelings about them. Like that's like kind of the irony is you can look at other things, but it's still based on a feeling where as human beings, it's hard for us to actually get out of our feelings because it's so much of like how we just interpret the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so at times it can lead you where you can have a desire in your heart and you can like feel it out and be like, oh, and you can find that it's actually really true and life-giving. But at other times it can lead you really astray where you can have this desire and have this feeling that you're like, oh, I think this is who I want to be or what I want to do or what I want to lean into. But it can ultimately lead you down a path that you didn't initially want to go and that you aren't fully realizing isn't actually the best path for you. And a great example of this is actually airplanes. And so I learned this recently. I didn't know this before. But before they were able to invent a jet, they had just kind of normal planes. So like imagine World
Like
War
a
II.
propeller
And
plane?
yeah, and
Okay.
like things like that, where it wasn't going at this insane, crazy speed, that it was more, I don't know, chill. And in flying a plane like that, pilots were able to actually trust their feelings because it was more normal. The speed was less than like a jet, and you weren't able to do all the things that you can do in a jet. You couldn't just like do all these crazy tricks and whatever that they can do now. And so the pilot was able to just trust their feelings as to how they would fly the plane, and it would usually end well. That how good a pilot was based on how intuitive they were in their feelings in the moment. And that changed when they invented the jet because everything was going at such a fast pace that our bodies can't actually feel correctly, and it confuses your brain. And so often what pilots will do as like a joke, so if you're, I don't know, trying to get your license to learn how to fly a jet for some reason, they think it's funny and a fun illustration to take you flying in a jet, to go at an incredibly fast speed, and then while they're flying to ask you which direction you're feeling, and not like north, south, east, west, but whether or not you think that if you were to go up, whether you would be heading towards the ground or heading farther up into the sky. And every time people will get it wrong. because your body gets so confused in the plane because you're going at such an accelerated speed that you're no longer able to discern your feelings, and your feelings are often wrong. That people say, oh, if we go up, I'm going up into the air, and they're like, no, we're going straight into the ground, we're upside down right now, that they have no idea. And so they had to invent tools in order for people to be able to figure out what was actually true while they were in the air. And so they have all of these different monitors and all of these different dials that essentially tell them where they are, what their elevation is, where they're pointing. And that's what they have to look at to actually discern what's going on, because their feelings aren't reliable when you're going at a speed like that. And that's kind of like life. As followers of Jesus, we believe that the world was made great and perfect. And that we used to live in a creation that didn't have sickness or death or pain or sin or any of those things at all. But when we chose to rebel against God and to go against the way he designed the world, we actually brought this thing called sin into the world, and it corrupted not just creation, bringing in sickness and death and pain, but even ourselves, where we have this kind of almost like a spiritual disease called sin that affects and taints the way we see the world. And sin is kind of like the invention of the jet, where it has kind of tainted our feelings to a point that we can't always tell what is true and which way is up and which way is down. And so our feelings were designed to help us understand the world, but now have almost been tainted in a way that they aren't always reliable. And sometimes if you trust your feelings, it can lead you into a path that's correct. But other times it can lead you like straight into the ground. And that's not where you want to be if you're in a jet flying at, I don't know, an insane, ridiculous speed. Is you want to go in the direction you want to head in. And so often our feelings can lead us astray like that. And what Jeremiah is saying here is that if we put our trust only in our feelings and think that they're going to be what brings us life and leads us to the life we're looking for, that we're going to find that that's quickly not true. And I can't tell you how many stories I've had of people who I've met with who have done something where they've trusted their feeling and what felt good and felt right, and it's led to tons of brokenness. And even in the moment, they didn't realize all the damage it was causing in their lives and to other people. And even for my own story, I've shared that where I felt like there was lots of things in life that were going to bring me fulfillment and joy. And when I chased and pursued those things, I actually found that they led me to emptiness and nothingness. And that actually was in trusting God and surrendering myself and being like, God, even when you're instructing things or telling me that this is how I want you to live and how I design you to be, and it's hard for me to understand it, and I'm like, I don't know if that's really true. That doesn't really seem right. I've always found that it actually is true, and that it actually does lead to flourishing, and that often my feelings, although sometimes are helpful, have often led me astray, where I've gone in a direction that I never wanted to go.
So I think one question I would have is that we're not saying you have to ignore your feelings, but instead, maybe one way to think about it is to be curious about our feelings.
Yeah.
So you're like, okay, I have this feeling, but I'm not just going to like take it at face value and run with wherever it guides me, but instead be like, I have this feeling, like maybe why do I have this feeling? Or what is this feeling pushing me towards? And is that what I really want? Like just kind of step back. And so I think like actually people our age, your age, these guys' age, are getting pretty intuitive and aware of their feelings, maybe more than previous generations have been, like because of that push to be more aware of our feelings, which isn't all negative, but we do want to have some awareness of our feelings and to think about them and to take them to someone maybe, to ask some questions. And so the best person is God.
Yeah.
To take them to be like, okay, I have this feeling. Why do I have this feeling? What should I do with this? Do I lean into it and follow it with where it's guiding me or not? Like, what are your thoughts? But the problem is that we're quite impulsive.
Yeah.
And so we don't want to do that, especially when it's exciting to follow our feeling for good or bad, right? I mean, exciting meaning you can be really, really mad and follow that feeling to be really rude to someone, and that can actually feel good in the moment.
Yeah.
Where you're like, I want to follow this feeling because it's going to like give me that rush of the extreme emotion and experience that that'll lead to, but it's just not always positive. So it actually takes practice to learn to notice your own feelings before reacting out of that feeling.
Well, and that's why even having things like a small group where it's like a community of people that you can trust who are able to speak into your life is really helpful, because you can have somebody outside of your own personal feelings speaking into how they're seeing the situation. But then again, they're still just people, and people get stuff wrong. And that's why things like reading your Bible and prayer are actually like so important. It's not just like read your Bible because God says so. It's like, it's because in that you're able to clearly feel and discern, oh, what is God saying here? Maybe he has something to say about this. And then in praying it and bringing it before him and being like, God, I'm feeling this. What do you think? That it's able to help you discern what is maybe actually true. And again, in reading the Bible, you have feelings. We don't always read it perfectly. We don't always fully understand it. In praying, sometimes you can feel things that aren't fully true, but that God actually does want to walk alongside us and is able to help guide us to hopefully help us be able to walk into a path that is flourishing, versus us just kind of wandering, hoping we maybe get it right. And then end up
just
somewhere we didn't
following
want to
your emotions kind of
Yeah.
on whatever whim they take you to. I think eventually that doesn't actually feel good.
No.
Like you feel kind of out of control
Yeah.
and kind of chaotic. And I don't think that anybody thrives following every emotion that comes. And we all kind
No.
of know that when we stop
Yeah.
to think about it. But I think getting in the habits of pausing before reacting emotionally and just taking our emotions to God, just being like, God, this is how I feel, and being honest about it is like the biggest first steps to helping with that. The question we want you guys to discuss next is, do you have an example of a time where following your feelings failed you? Hopefully you guys had some examples within each other, your small group leaders, of when your feelings have failed you, when you followed them. And the example that I thought of was just when I don't feel like working out, when I don't feel like getting outside, when I don't feel like moving my body because I actually feel lazy. And how when I pursue that feeling of laziness, I actually just feel grosser as the day goes on. But when I am like, nope, this is how I feel, but I know that if I go work out or go for a hike or just go for a walk, get outside, that I actually will feel better. And the more you do that, the more you know to ignore that feeling.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of the whole main point of this thing, is that feelings are helpful, but often aren't going to fully lead us to the life we want to live. That if you always trusted your feeling to just, I don't want to work out, I don't feel like it, it would lead to not fully flourishing. That eventually you would become out of shape and be like, oh, shoot, I should have hiked that mountain or done whatever. That's kind of the life that I was wanting to find flourishing in. And just like how Curtis wasn't very trustworthy in telling you your attire for parties, our feelings aren't always trustworthy in leading us into the life that we actually truly want to live, and it'll actually make us feel like, oh, we're actually flourishing, we're feeling, I don't know, quote unquote blessed or whatever. And God is actually the one who can guide us in that path, that he's actually someone who's able to see clearly, that he's able to actually see things as they are. And he's the only one who's actually able to like bring that trustworthy advice. And he's also never changing his mind on things, that he actually knows what's true and knows what's untrue and is able to actually guide us correctly. And Jeremiah talks about how we should put our trust in him, and essentially that we should put a little less trust than maybe our culture does in our feelings. That having desires, having feelings are great. They can help you discern what's maybe true, but to fully put your trust in them is not ideal because we live in a world that's broken, and because even our like feeling compass is often broken. Just like how if you're in a jet and you're flying, you're not always able to tell which way's up and which way's down. Our feelings are often like that, where if you always trust them, sometimes it can lead to life in the direction you want to go. Other times it can lead you crashing into the ground, and that's not where you want to be. And so feelings aren't worth your trust, but Jesus is. And just like working out, if you always just sat on the couch and ate chips, that's not the life you want to live.
You probably wouldn't feel very good.
No, you got to go lift some weights and hurt yourself in other ways.
Get some fresh air.
Get some fresh air. Yeah, totally. And so with that being said, that's our thoughts for today.
Yeah, you guys can take a minute to pray for each other, and we'll talk to you again next week.
See you then.